The blood on the marble floor had long since dried into a rust-colored stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Mrs. Adelaide Thornfield, the head housekeeper of the Blackwood estate, stood frozen in the grand ballroom at 3:30. In the morning, her oil lamp casting dancing shadows across the ornate walls. The crystal chandelier above her swayed gently despite the absence of any wind, its faceted drops catching the flickering light like 1,000 watching eyes. She had been drawn from her bed by the sound a waltz. She was certain of it, the same melody that had played during the last grand ball nearly 6 months ago. But as she stood there now, the silence was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of water from somewhere high above in the mansion's elaborate coffered ceiling. The lamp trembled in her weathered hands as she approached the stain. It was larger than she remembered, spreading outward from the center of the ballroom like the petals of some grotesque flower. But it was what lay beside the stain that made her breath catch in her throat. A single white glove, pristine and untouched by time, as if it had been placed there only moments before Mrs. Thornfield knew that glove. She had helped its owner put it on countless times, adjusting the delicate pearl buttons, smoothing the silk-up pale, slender arms. Arms that had not been seen in Newport society for nearly half a year. The glove belonged to Vivian Ashworth, the most celebrated and ultimately the most reviled socialite of Newport's Gilded Age elite. A woman who had vanished without a trace on the night of November 15th, 1889, leaving behind only whispers, scandals, and questions that would haunt the seaside resort town for generations to come. But what Mrs. Thornfield discovered that night would prove that some disappearances are not endings, they are transformations. And some secrets buried beneath the opulent facades of America's grandest estates are better left undisturbed. What happened to Vivian Ashworth? And why, 6 months after her disappearance, were traces of her presence still appearing in places where no living person should be able to tread? To understand the mystery of Vivian Ashworth, one must first understand Newport in the autumn of 1889. This was the era of the great cottage mansions, though calling these architectural marvels cottages was perhaps the grandest understatement. Of the Gilded Age, these were palaces built by America's industrial titans, the Vanderbilts. The Astors, the Whitney's summer retreats that rivaled European palaces in their opulence and exceeded them in their ostentation. Newport was a stage, and its seasonal residents were the players in an elaborate performance of wealth and status. But like all stages, it had its hidden machinery, its dark corners behind the glittering facade. And it was in these shadows that the most fascinating and dangerous dramas unfolded. Vivian Ashworth had not been born to this world. Born Vivian Beaumont in a modest brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, she was the daughter of a successful but unremarkable textile merchant. Her beauty, however, was anything but unremarkable. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing an almost ethereal quality alabaster skin that seemed to glow from within, midnight black hair that she wore in elaborate Gibson girl styles, and eyes of such a pale green that they appeared almost colorless in certain light. But it was not merely her physical beauty that set her apart. Vivian possessed what the society papers of the time called magnetic charm, an ability to draw people into her orbit with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. Men fell over themselves to earn her attention, and women found themselves simultaneously envious and inexplicably drawn to her presence. Her marriage to Thomas Ashworth in 1885 had been the social event of the Boston season. Thomas was the heir to a shipping fortune, a man 20 years her senior, with connections that stretched from the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill to the marble corridors of Newport's most exclusive estates. With her marriage, Vivian Beaumont disappeared forever, replaced by Mrs. Thomas Ashworth, a woman who seemed to have been born wearing diamonds and speaking in the cultured tones of old money. The Ashworths' arrival in Newport society was nothing short of meteoric. Within 2 seasons, Vivian had established herself as one of the resort's most sought-after hostesses. Her parties were legendary elaborate affairs that lasted until dawn, where European royalty mingled with American industrialists, where fortunes were won and lost over games of whist, and where secrets were traded like precious commodities. But Newport society, for all its glitter, was built on rigid rules and ancient grudges. The old families, those who could trace their American lineage back to the Mayflower, looked upon the newly wealthy with barely concealed disdain. They tolerated the Astors and Vanderbilts because their fortunes were simply too vast to ignore. But newer arrivals, like the Ashworths, walked a precarious tightrope between acceptance and ostracism. Vivian seemed to thrive on this tension. Where other new money wives sought approval through careful conformity, she chose a different path. She pushed boundaries, challenged conventions, and seemed to take particular pleasure in making the old guard uncomfortable. She was the first to wear Worth gowns cut daringly low. She was the first to serve champagne at afternoon teas. She was the first to invite actresses to her dinner parties. The whispers began almost immediately. They started in the ladies' parlors and spread through the servants' quarters like smoke through a house fire. Where had she really come from? How had a merchant's daughter acquired such sophisticated tastes so quickly? Why did she never speak of her family, never mention her childhood? And why, several sharp-eyed dowagers noticed, did she never seem to age, even as the seasons passed? By the summer of 1889, the whispers had become something more dangerous rumors. With teeth. There were stories of strange gatherings at the Ashworth estate, meetings that took place in the hours after midnight when respectable people were asleep in their beds. Servants spoke in hushed tones of finding strange symbols drawn in ash on the marble floors, of hearing voices speaking in languages that hurt the ear, of seeing figures in flowing robes moving through the gardens when the moon was new. Thomas Ashworth, once so enamored of his beautiful young wife, began to show signs of strain. Those who saw him at the reading room or the casino noticed how his hands shook when he reached for his brandy, how his eyes had developed a haunted quality, how he seemed to start at shadows. When pressed by concerned friends, he would only say that marriage had revealed aspects of his wife that he had not anticipated. And then there was the matter of the Blackwood estate. The Blackwood mansion had stood empty for nearly a decade, since the tragic deaths of its owners in a fire that investigators could never fully explain. The grand house, with its Gothic revival architecture and commanding view of the Atlantic, should have been a prize property. Instead, it had become something of a local ghost story. Servants refused to work there. Potential buyers found excuses to withdraw their offers. Even the homeless avoided seeking shelter within its walls during Newport's harsh winter months. But in the spring of 1889, Vivian Ashworth had surprised everyone by negotiating a lease on the property. She claimed she wanted it for artistic pursuits, a studio where she could paint and write away from the social obligations of her primary residence. Thomas had objected strenuously, but Vivian had prevailed, as she always seemed to do when her mind was set on something. What she actually did in that house, during those long afternoons and mysterious evening visits, would become the subject of the most scandalous speculation Newport had ever seen. The first sign that something was deeply amiss came in late July of 1889, barely 2 months after Vivian had taken possession of the Blackwood estate. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, one of Newport's most respected physicians, was returning from a difficult birth at a cottage near the point, when he noticed lights in the windows of the supposedly empty mansion. This was not entirely unusual in itself. Mrs. Ashworth was known to visit the property at odd hours, but as Dr. Hartwell later testified to the police, these were not the steady glow of gas lamps or the flickering of candles. These lights moved with purpose, forming patterns in the windows, creating geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an inner rhythm. Curious despite himself, the good doctor had approached the house on foot, leaving his carriage at a discreet distance. The night was warm and still, the kind of summer evening that made Newport a paradise for the wealthy. But as he drew closer to the Blackwood estate, the temperature seemed to drop by degrees, until his breath was visible in small puffs of vapor. What he saw through the ground floor windows would haunt him for the rest of his life. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, creating a large open space in what had once been the main parlor. The wooden floor was covered with intricate symbols, drawn in what appeared to be white chalk or ashes circles within circles. Stars, crescents, and shapes that hurt to look at directly. And there, in the center of this elaborate design, stood Vivian Ashworth. She was dressed not in her usual evening attire, but in a flowing robe of deep burgundy that seemed to absorb the strange light rather than reflect it. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she was chanting in a language Dr. Hartwell could not identify, though the words seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. But she was not alone. Arranged around her in a perfect circle were 7 figures, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They swayed in unison, their voices joining hers in that inhuman chorus. And as Dr. Hartwell watched in growing horror, he realized that the figures were not quite the right shape to be human beings. They were too tall, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid. The doctor would later swear, under oath, that he had only watched for a few moments. But when he finally tore himself away from that mesmerizing scene, he found that his pocket watch read 3:37 in the morning. Nearly 4 hours had passed without his awareness. He stumbled back to his carriage, his mind reeling, and drove home through the empty streets with a desperate need to convince himself that what he had seen was merely a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the play of shadows. But the memory remained crystal clear, burned into his consciousness like a brand. Dr. Hartwell was a rational man, a man of science. He had been educated at Harvard Medical School, had trained in the great hospitals of Boston and New York. He did not believe in ghosts or witchcraft or any of the superstitious nonsense that occasionally surfaced in his practice. But what he had witnessed that night challenged every assumption he held about the nature of reality. He might have convinced himself it was all a dream, might have filed the memory away as an aberration, if not for what he discovered the next morning. Mary Catherine O'Brien had worked as a scullery maid in Newport's finest houses for nearly 15 years. She was known for her discretion, her hard work, and her unshakable Irish Catholic faith. She was not given to flights of fancy or idle gossip, which made her account of the events at the Ashworth estate all the more disturbing. Mary had been hired by Mrs. Ashworth in June of 1889 to help maintain the main residence while the mistress of the house spent increasing amounts of time at her studio in the Blackwood estate. The work was not difficult. The Ashworths entertained less frequently than other families of their standing, but Mary found the atmosphere in the house increasingly oppressive. She changed, Mary would later tell her priest, Father McKenna, during what she believed would be a confidential confession. Mrs. Ashworth, I mean, not just her manner, but her very person. When I first started working there, she was beautiful, yes, but in a natural way, like a woman should be. But as the summer wore on, she became otherworldly. The changes were subtle at first. Mrs. Ashworth's skin seemed to grow more translucent, so pale that the blue veins beneath were clearly visible. Her green eyes developed an inner light that made it difficult to look directly at her. And her voice began to carry harmonics that made the crystal glassware vibrate when she spoke. But it was not just Mrs. Ashworth's physical transformation that troubled Mary. It was the things she found in the house. Books appeared in the library, volumes bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. with titles in languages that predated Latin. Strange instruments materialized in the music. Room devices that bore no resemblance to any piano or violin Mary had ever seen. And the smell, there was always a smell now, like copper pennies and something organic left too long in the heat. The final straw came on the night of August 15th, 1889. Mary had stayed late to help prepare for a small dinner party Mrs. Ashworth was hosting the following evening. She was in the kitchen, washing the good china, when she heard the sound of conversation from the dining room above. This was not unusual. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth often entertained informal guests. But as Mary listened more carefully, she realized that only one voice was speaking. Mrs. Ashworth was having a conversation, responding to questions and comments, laughing at jokes, but she was the only person in the room. Curiosity overcoming propriety, Mary crept up the servants' stairs and peered through the keyhole into the dining room. What she saw nearly stopped her heart. That Mrs. Ashworth sat at the head of the table, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk. The table was set for 12, with the finest bone china and sterling silver. Candles burned in elaborate candelabras, casting dancing shadows across the room. And every chair was occupied. But the other 11 guests were not people. They were shadows, not the absence of light that shadows should be, but entities with substance and presence. They moved independently of any light source, reaching for wine glasses with arms made of darkness, turning their featureless faces toward their hostess when she spoke. And Mrs. Ashworth treated them as if they were the most natural dinner companions in the world. Mary O'Brien resigned her position the next morning. She refused to explain her reasons to the household manager, took her wages, and left Newport. That same day, she never spoke publicly about what she had seen, confiding only in her priest, who was bound by the seal of confession to keep her secrets. But Mary's sudden departure did not go unnoticed by Newport society. Servants were valuable commodities, and good ones did not leave desirable positions without cause. The questions began to circulate in the carefully modulated tones of polite inquiry. What had Mary O'Brien seen? What had driven her away from one of the most prestigious households in Newport? By September of 1889, the whispers about Vivian Ashworth had evolved into something far more dangerous: social scrutiny. Newport's matriarchs were not women to be trifled with. They had built their reputations on the ability to detect and eliminate threats to the established order, and Vivian had become precisely such a threat. The leader of this unofficial tribunal was Mrs. Cornelius Whitmore, a formidable woman in her 60s whose husband's railroad fortune had bought her a place among Newport's most influential hostesses. Mrs. Whitmore had watched Vivian's rise with growing unease, but it was the younger woman's increasing erratic behavior that finally prompted action. The confrontation came at Mrs. Whitmore's weekly Thursday afternoon tea, an institution that served as both social gathering and unofficial court of judgment. The cream of Newport society attended these affairs: the Vanderbilt women, the Astor representatives, the wives of senators and Supreme Court justices. An invitation was coveted. Exclusion was social death. Vivian arrived 45 minutes late, which was shocking enough in a society that valued punctuality as a moral virtue. But her appearance was what truly caused the assembled ladies to catch their collective breath. She wore a gown of pure white silk that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through Mrs. Whitmore's French windows. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated fresh flowers, but flowers that several sharp-eyed observers noted were varieties that did not grow anywhere on the East Coast. "My dear Vivian," Mrs. Whitmore began, her voice carrying the authority of generations of social dominance. "How lovely that you could join us. We were just discussing the upcoming harvest ball at the casino. I trust you and Thomas will be attending?" Vivian smiled, but it was not the practiced society smile that the other women recognized. This smile seemed to contain depths, layers of meaning that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "Oh, I'm afraid Thomas and I have other plans that evening," Vivian replied, her voice carrying those strange harmonics that made the fine china rattle almost imperceptibly. "We're hosting our own gathering, a much more intimate affair." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. The Harvest Ball was one of the most important social events of the Newport season. To skip it for a private party was not just poor form, it was a direct challenge to the established social hierarchy. "How unusual," Mrs. Whitmore said carefully. "And what sort of gathering might this be?" Vivian's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "A celebration of the old ways, Cornelius. The ways that predate your railroads and your stock exchanges. The ways that understand power in its purest form." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Several of the younger women actually gasped. Mrs. Jacob Astor's teacup rattled against its saucer. Even Mrs. Whitmore, for all her social armor, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But Vivian was not finished. She stood gracefully, her white gown seeming to ripple like water in motion. "I do hope you ladies will consider expanding your perspectives. The world is so much larger and more wonderful than your narrow little society allows. There are forces at work that make your husband's fortunes seem like children's pocket money." And then, in a display of social suicide that would be talked about for decades, Vivian Ashworth walked to the center of Mrs. Whitmore's carefully appointed parlor and began to speak in that same strange language Dr. Hartwell had heard through the windows of the Blackwood estate. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Senator Bradley fainted outright. The Astor wife fled from the room, claiming a sudden migraine. Several other guests followed suit, until only Mrs. Whitmore herself remained, staring at Vivian with a mixture of horror and fascination. As Vivian's voice rose, the very air in the room seemed to thicken. The afternoon sunlight dimmed despite the absence of clouds. The temperature dropped until frost began to form on the windows. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. Vivian smiled pleasantly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Thank you for a lovely afternoon, Cornelius. I do hope we can do this again soon." She walked calmly to the door, leaving Mrs. Whitmore alone in a parlor that now felt more like a tomb than a salon. It took the older woman nearly an hour to summon the courage to ring for her servants, and when they arrived, they found the room in perfect order except for the fact that every clock in the house had stopped at the exact moment Vivian began her incantation. Thomas Ashworth's decline began almost immediately after his wife's spectacular social immolation. Those who saw him in the days following the Thursday tea incident reported a man who seemed to be aging before their eyes. His once robust frame grew gaunt. His thick hair developed streaks of premature gray. His hands developed a constant tremor that no amount of brandy could still. But it was not just physical deterioration that marked Thomas's transformation. His behavior became increasingly erratic, swinging between periods of catatonic depression and manic rambling about subjects that made no sense to his listeners. Dr. Hartwell, despite his own traumatic experience at the Blackwood estate, remained Thomas's physician and confidant. In his private notes discovered years later in his estate papers, the doctor recorded conversations that painted a picture of a man trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake. "She's not the woman I married," Thomas told the doctor during a visit in early October. "I don't mean that metaphorically, Edmund. I mean she is literally not the same person. The woman I fell in love with in Boston died some time after we arrived in Newport, and something else is wearing her face." Dr. Hartwell, mindful of his own disturbing encounter, pressed for details. What he heard chilled him to the bone. Thomas described waking in the middle of the night to find his wife's side of the bed empty and cold, as if it had been unoccupied for hours. When he searched the house, he would find no trace of her, despite the fact that the doors remained locked and the servants swore no one had left the building. He spoke of conversations with Vivian that he could only half remember, discussions of plans and purposes that seemed vitally important while they were happening, but dissolved into meaningless fragments when he tried to recall them later. Most disturbing of all, he described a growing certainty that his wife was somehow aware of his every thought, his every doubt, his every moment of fear. He had taken to sleeping in his study, claiming it was the only room in the house where he felt truly alone. "She's planning something, Edmund," Thomas confided during what would be their last private conversation. "Something that involves more than just her peculiar hobbies at the Blackwood place. She's been receiving letters, dozens of them, from places I've never heard of. Cities with names that hurt to pronounce. And the visitors. God help me. The visitors." Dr. Hartwell leaned forward. "What visitors?" Thomas's hands shook as he reached for his brandy. "They come at night, after the servants are asleep. I watch from my study window as they approach the house. They don't walk, Edmund. They glide, like they're floating just above the ground. And their faces ... He shuddered. "Their faces are wrong. Not deformed, exactly, but wrong in a way that makes you want to look anywhere else." The doctor tried to convince his friend to leave Newport, to take Vivian away from whatever influences had taken hold of her. But Thomas shook his head with the resignation of a man who had already lost hope. "You don't understand," he said. "I can't leave. Not anymore. She's bound me to her somehow. Bound me to this place. When I try to make plans to go, my mind just ... slides away from the idea. Like trying to hold water in your bare hands." Dr. Hartwell left that meeting with the uncomfortable certainty that he had just spoken with a man who was already dead, even though his heart continued to beat and his lungs continued to draw breath. November arrived in Newport with an unseasonable warmth that made the locals uneasy. The trees should have been bare by the 15th, but leaves still clung to branches in defiance of natural order. The ocean, typically gray and choppy as winter approached, remained an unsettling shade of deep green that reminded observers of stagnant pond water. It was against this backdrop of atmospheric wrongness that Vivian Ashworth sent out her invitations. They were not the usual engraved cards that Newport society expected for formal gatherings. These invitations were written by hand on paper. That felt wrong to the touch, too smooth, too warm, almost organic. The ink seemed to shift and move under direct light, and several recipients swore that the writing changed depending on the angle from which it was viewed. The invitation itself was simple. "Mrs. Thomas Ashworth requests the pleasure of your company for an evening of revelation and transformation. November 15th, 1889. The Blackwood Estate. 10 o'clock in the evening. Come as you are, leave as you will." Most of Newport's social elite found excuses to decline. The Vanderbilts claimed prior engagements. The Astors developed sudden illnesses. Mrs. Whitmore cited her advanced age and the unseasonable weather. But a few, the curious, the desperate, the socially ambitious accepted. Dr. Hartwell was not invited, but his concern for Thomas Ashworth led him to position himself in the offing grounds surrounding the Blackwood estate on that fateful evening. What he witnessed from his hiding place among the overgrown gardens would be recorded in a secret journal that he kept locked in a safe deposit box for the remainder of his life. The guests began arriving just after 10 o'clock. Dr. Hartwell counted 12 carriages in total, though some of them seemed to arrive without making any sound, their horses' hooves falling silently on the gravel drive. The guests themselves were a mixture of familiar faces and strangers. He recognized several of Newport's more adventurous socialites, but others were unknown to him, despite his decades of residence in the community. But it was not the guests who captured his attention. It was what else emerged from the carriages. Alongside each human guest was a companion, a shadow figure similar to what Mary O'Brien had described seeing at the Ashworth dinner table. These entities moved independently of any light source, maintaining their dark substance, even under the full moon that hung overhead like a watchful eye. The procession moved toward the mansion's main entrance, where Vivian Ashworth waited to greet her guests. She wore a gown of midnight black that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it, and her pale skin glowed with an inner luminescence that made her appear more spirit than flesh. As each guest approached, she performed a ritual of greeting that Dr. Hartwell could not quite make out from his distant observation point. But the effect was immediately apparent. Each person who received her welcome seemed to change, standing straighter, moving with a fluid grace that had not been present moments before. The last guest entered the house at precisely 11 o'clock, and the massive oak doors swung shut with a sound like thunder. For the next 4 hours, Dr. Hartwell maintained his vigil, watching the windows of the mansion glow with that same pulsing geometric light he had witnessed months earlier. But this time, the light was brighter, more intense. It cast shadows that moved independently across the grounds, shadows that seemed to reach toward him with grasping tendrils. The temperature dropped steadily throughout the night until frost covered the ground despite the unseasonable warmth. Of the afternoon at 3 o'clock in the morning, the chanting began. It was not the single voice Dr. Hartwell had heard before, but a chorus, dozens of voices rising in harmonies that seemed to bypass human hearing and resonate directly in the listener's bones. The sound built steadily, growing in power and complexity, until the very air seemed to vibrate with supernatural energy. And then, at the stroke of 4 o'clock, the chanting stopped. The lights in the mansion's windows went dark. An absolute silence fell over the estate, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the cliff face. Dr. Hartwell waited until dawn before approaching the house. What he found there would convince him that some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate, some truths too terrible to reveal. Dawn came slowly to Newport on November 16, 1889, filtered through clouds that hung low and gray despite the previous day's unseasonable warmth. Dr. Hartwell approached the Blackwood estate with the caution of a man who had already seen too much. But his concern for Thomas Ashworth and the other guests drove him forward despite his better judgment. The mansion stood silent and imposing against the gray morning sky, its Gothic revival architecture more menacing than majestic in the pale light. The carriages that had brought the guests the night before were gone, vanished as silently as they had arrived. But there were other signs of the previous evening's activities, signs that made the doctor's blood run cold. Every window in the mansion had been shattered from the inside out. Glass littered the ground in patterns that formed the same geometric shapes Dr. Hartwell had seen drawn on the floors during his earlier reconnaissance. The front door, which had closed so definitively at 11 o'clock, now hung open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to have substance. Dr. Hartwell called out, his voice echoing strangely in the morning air. There was no response. The silence was absolute, oppressive, like the quiet that follows a scream. Steeling himself, he crossed the threshold into the mansion's grand foyer. The smell hit him immediately, not the copper and organic decay he had come to associate with Vivian's activities, but something far worse. It was the smell of burnt ozone, of air that had been superheated and then flash frozen. It was the smell of reality itself having been damaged. The interior of the house had been altered. The elaborate furnishings that had once filled the rooms were gone, but not removed, consumed. Scorch marks on the walls and floor suggested they had been burned away by some force that generated no visible flame. The very walls themselves seemed somehow diminished, as if their substance had been partially drained away, but it was in the main ballroom, the site of Vivian's previous rituals. That Dr. Hartwell made his most disturbing discovery. The 12 guests were still there. They sat in a perfect circle in the center of the room, still wearing their evening attire, still maintaining the postures of polite conversation. But they were no longer alive. They were not dead either, in any sense that Dr. Hartwell's medical training could define. They were something else entirely. Their skin had taken on the same translucent quality that had marked Vivian's transformation. Throughout the summer, their eyes, when he worked up the courage to look directly at them, held no pupils, no iris, just an endless depth that seemed to stretch back into infinity. They breathed in perfect unison, but each breath took exactly 1 minute to complete dot when Dr. Hartwell spoke to them. They turned their heads toward him with mechanical precision, but showed no other sign of awareness. When he touched one Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of a steel magnate from Pittsburgh, her skin felt like marble that had been warmed by the sun. But there was no pulse beneath the surface, no heartbeat. They had been transformed into something that existed between life and death, conscious but not alive, present but somehow removed from the physical world. They were exhibits in some cosmic museum, specimens preserved for purposes Dr. Hartwell could not begin to understand. But most disturbing of all was what was missing from this tableau of horror. Thomas Ashworth and Vivian herself were nowhere. To be found out, it was Mrs. Adelaide Thornfield who discovered the truth about what had happened to Thomas and Vivian Ashworth. The head housekeeper had arrived at the Blackwood estate 3 days after Dr. Hartwell's initial investigation, sent by the Newport police to conduct a more thorough search of the property. Mrs. Thornfield was a practical woman, not given to flights of supernatural fancy. She had seen Dr. Hartwell's report, heavily edited to remove the more unbelievable details, and assumed that the missing couple had simply fled Newport to escape the social scandal that had engulfed them. Her job was to inventory the property and prepare it for closure. But as she moved through the mansion's rooms, catalog book in hand, she began to understand that this was no ordinary disappearance. The house itself seemed to resist her presence, fighting her attempts to document its contents. Rooms that had been empty when she entered them would somehow contain furniture when she looked again. Shadows moved independently of any light source. And always, there was the sound of voices just at the edge of hearing, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. It was while searching for the mansion's wine cellar that Mrs. Thornfield discovered the basement rooms that did not appear on any of the house's architectural plans. Hidden behind a panel in the kitchen's pantry was a narrow staircase that descended, far deeper than the foundations of the house should have allowed. The air grew colder with each step downward, and the walls carved from living rock were covered with the same symbols that had appeared throughout Vivian's activities. But these symbols were not drawn in chalk or ash. They had been cut directly into the stone, filled with a substance that glowed with its own inner light. At the bottom of the stairs was a chamber that defied physical possibility. It was vast, stretching away into darkness far beyond what the mansion's footprint should have contained. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above, and the walls curved away in impossible geometries that hurt to contemplate directly. But it was what occupied the center of this underground cathedral that stopped Mrs. Thornfield's heart. A structure rose from the chamber's floor, not built, but grown like some massive organic mechanism. It pulsed with the same inner light as the symbols on the walls, and its surface was covered with what looked like veins or arteries that carried luminous fluid in complex patterns. The thing was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are. Beautiful, mesmerizing, and deadly. And suspended within this organic machine, preserved in translucent pods like insects in amber, were Thomas and Vivian Ashworth. Thomas hung motionless, his eyes closed, his face peaceful for the first time in months. The constant fear and anxiety that had marked his final weeks had been erased, replaced by an expression of absolute serenity. but his body was changing, elongating, becoming more angular, more graceful. His human form was being refined, perfected, transformed into something that could exist in spaces between spaces. Vivian floated in the pod beside him, but her transformation was far more advanced. She had become something magnificent and terrible, her human features sublimed into geometries that belonged to no earthly plane. Her skin had become translucent, revealing patterns of light that moved beneath like living constellations. Her hair flowed around her head as if suspended in water, but it was no longer dark. It had become threads of pure starlight, and she was awake. Her eyes, no longer green, but filled with the depth of space itself, tracked Mrs. Thornfield's movement as the housekeeper stumbled backward in terror. Those impossible eyes held intelligence, awareness, and something that might have been amusement. When Vivian smiled, her lips moved with perfect clarity, forming words that bypassed Mrs. Thornfield's ears and spoke directly to her mind. The transformation is not yet complete, but it will be. Soon we will emerge into a world that is ready for us, and those who witnessed our ascension will serve as our heralds. Mrs. Thornfield fled. She ran up those impossible stairs, through the twisted corridors of the Blackwood estate, and out into the gray November morning. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave way, collapsing finally on the lawn of a neighboring estate, where the groundskeepers found her hours later, babbling about machines made of light and gods wearing human faces. When the police returned to investigate her claims, they found the basement entrance sealed, not blocked, but sealed, as if the stone had flowed together like liquid and then hardened into seamless rock. No amount of excavation could reveal the hidden chamber again. The official report stated that Thomas and Vivian Ashworth had fled Newport under cover of darkness, abandoning their property and their debts. The 12 guests from the final gathering were found in various states of catatonic stupor throughout the city, alive but fundamentally changed in ways that doctors could not explain or treat. They lived out their remaining years in private sanatoriums, staring at nothing, breathing in that same synchronized rhythm, whispering occasionally in languages that belonged to no human culture. But Mrs. Thornfield knew the truth. The Ashworths had not fled, they had evolved. They had used the rituals, the symbols, the otherworldly knowledge that Vivian had somehow acquired to transform themselves into something that could exist between dimensions, something that could manipulate reality itself. And they were still down there in that impossible chamber beneath the Blackwood estate, completing their metamorphosis, waiting for the moment when they would emerge into a world that they would remake in their own image. In the weeks following the disappearance, Dr. Hartwell began his own investigation into the true nature of what had occurred. His medical training had taught him to look for patterns, for underlying causes that explained seemingly unrelated symptoms. What he discovered in the libraries and archives of Newport, Boston, and New York painted a picture far more disturbing than a simple case of occult experimentation gone wrong. The Blackwood estate, he learned, had a history that stretched back long before the Gothic revival mansion had been built. The land itself had been considered cursed by the Narragansett tribes who had once inhabited the region. They had stories of a place where the walls between worlds grew thin, where entities from other planes of existence could slip through into the physical realm. The first European settlers had reported strange phenomena on the Socialite inn. The sky that moved with intelligence, voices speaking from empty air, and a persistent sense that the land itself was watching, evaluating, waiting. Several attempts to build on the property had ended in tragedy. Houses that collapsed without cause, families that vanished without trace, livestock that refused to graze in the area. But it was the pattern of the previous owners that truly chilled Dr. Hartwell's blood. Every family that had possessed the land had eventually produced an individual who became obsessed with what the historical records euphemistically called natural philosophy, the study of forces, beyond conventional understanding. And in each case, that individual had eventually vanished, leaving behind only stories of strange rituals and impossible transformations. The Blackwoods, themselves, the family for whom the current mansion was named, had been the most recent example before the Ashworths. Jonathan Blackwood had been a respected merchant and pillar of Newport society until 1878, when he had begun conducting what his contemporaries described as scientific experiments of a most peculiar nature. His wife and children had died in the fire that had officially ended the family's residence, but Jonathan's body had never been found. Dr. Hartwell realized with growing horror that the land itself was the constant in its pattern. Something dwelled there, something ancient and patient, that selected certain individuals for transformation. It provided them with knowledge, with power, with the tools necessary to transcend human limitations. But the price was their humanity itself. Vivian Ashworth had not discovered occult secrets on her own. She had been chosen, called to the Blackwood estate by forces that had been waiting for the right candidate. Her beauty, her magnetic personality, her natural ability to influence others, these had all been enhanced and directed by the entity that dwelled beneath the mansion. The rituals, the symbols, the gradual transformation, all of it had been preparation for the final metamorphosis that Mrs. Thornfield had witnessed. Vivian and Thomas had not died. They had been reborn as something that could serve as bridges between the human world and the realm from which their patron operated. And, if the pattern held true, they would not remain in their chrysalis state forever. Eventually, they would emerge, armed with powers that defied natural law, ready to recruit others to their cause, and to prepare the world for a transformation far grander than anything Newport society could imagine. The thought kept Dr. Hartwell awake at night for the rest of his life. Which brings us back to where our story began. Mrs. Adelaide Thornfield, standing in the ballroom of the Blackwood estate in the early hours of March 15th, 1890, exactly 4 months after the disappearance. The white glove lay beside the bloodstain that had never fully disappeared from the marble floor, pristine and impossible. But as Mrs. Thornfield bent to examine it more closely, she realized that it was not quite the same glove she had helped Vivian put on so many times. The material was too fine, too perfect. The pearl buttons gleamed with an inner light that no earthly pearl possessed. And when she touched it, God help her, she couldn't resist touching it. It felt warm, as if it had just been removed from a living hand. The footsteps began as she knelt there, frozen by the implications of what she held. Slow, measured steps descending the grand staircase that led to the ballroom. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. The intervals between steps were too long, as if the walker was moving through a medium thicker than air dot. Mrs. Thornfield looked up, and her scream died in her throat. Vivian Ashworth stood at the bottom of the stairs, beautiful beyond human comprehension and terrible beyond human understanding. Her transformation was complete. Now she had become something that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, her form shifting and flowing like liquid light. Her face retained its essential features, but they had been perfected, idealized, until she resembled nothing so much as a classical statue brought to life by divine will. "Adelaide," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the crystal chandeliers sing in response. "How good of you to return. I was hoping we might have a chance to speak." Mrs. Thornfield tried to run, but found that her legs would not obey her. She was held in place not by physical force, but by the simple impossibility of looking away from the transformed woman who had once employed her. "You're frightened, Vivian." Observed with what might have been compassion. "I understand. Change is always frightening, especially change of this magnitude. But I want you to know that everything we did, everything I became, was for humanity's benefit." She moved closer, and Mrs. Thornfield could see that the air around Vivian shimmered with energy, with potential that waited to be shaped by will. Alone, the old world is ending, Adelaide. The world of narrow minds and small dreams, of people who measure success in dollars and status in titles. A new age is coming, an age when humanity will take its place among the cosmic powers, when we will no longer be confined to this single plane of existence. Thomas and I are the first, but we will not be the last. Already, others are being called, being prepared for the transformation. Some will resist fear, makes people cling to limitations, but eventually they will understand. They will see that what we offer is not death, but apotheosis. Vivian extended her hand toward Mrs. Thornfield, and the housekeeper could see that her fingers were no longer entirely human. They were elongated, graceful, and tipped with what looked like crystalline nails that refracted light into impossible colors. You could join us, Adelaide. You've seen the truth of what we've become. You could be among the first to embrace the new reality, to help us guide humanity through the transition. The alternative. She smiled, and Mrs. Thornfield saw stars being born and dying in the depths of her eyes. The alternative is to remain trapped in a world that no longer has room for those who refuse evolution. Mrs. Thornfield found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely a whisper. What ... What happened to the others? The guests from that night? Vivian's smile deepened. They serve as anchors now, as focal points between the dimensions. Their consciousness exists in a state of permanent ecstasy, experiencing realities that their old selves could never have imagined. They are no longer limited by flesh, by time, by the petty concerns that once consumed them. In a way, they are more fortunate than we are. They achieved transcendence without having to bear the responsibility of shepherding others through the change. The offer hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibilities that Mrs. Thornfield's mind could barely grasp. She understood, on some level beyond rational thought, that this was a genuine choice. She could accept Vivian's transformation and become part of something greater than human, or she could refuse and face whatever consequences awaited those who rejected this new evolution. Mrs. Thornfield closed her eyes, whispered a prayer to a God she hoped still existed in whatever new reality was being born, and made her choice. The official records of Newport from the spring of 1890 make no mention of Mrs. Adelaide Thornfield's second visit to the Blackwood estate. Indeed, they make no mention of Mrs. Thornfield at all after her initial report to the police in November of 1889. She simply vanished from the historical record, as if she had never existed. The Blackwood mansion stood empty for another decade. Before being demolished in 1900, the new owners, a steel magnate from Pittsburgh who had never heard the local stories, built a modern Beaux-Arts-style cottage on the site. But that house, too, eventually developed a reputation for strangeness. Guests reported dreams of geometric patterns and voices speaking in unknown languages. Servants found symbols drawn in ash on freshly cleaned floors. And on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, witnesses claimed to see figures moving through the room's tall, graceful beings that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Dr. Hartwell lived until 1923, dying at the age of 81 in his sleep. His private journals, discovered in his estate papers, provided the most complete account of the events surrounding Vivian Ashworth's transformation. But even his meticulous documentation raised more questions than it answered. Who or what had been responsible for selecting Vivian for her otherworldly education? How had she acquired knowledge of rituals and symbols that predated recorded human civilization? And most disturbing of all, if her claims about ushering in a new age of human evolution were true, where were the others she had promised would follow? Today, Newport continues to draw visitors from around the world, attracted by its Gilded Age mansions and picturesque coastal setting. The site where the Blackwood estate once stood is now occupied by a luxury condominium complex, home to retired executives and seasonal residents who pay premium prices for ocean views and historic ambience. But longtime residents still tell stories. They speak of apartments where the temperature drops without explanation, where electronics malfunction in patterns that form geometric shapes, where residents report dreams of floating in pods of light, while voices promise transformation and transcendence. The local historical society maintains no records of the Ashworth family or their spectacular disappearance. Official documents from 1889 show gaps, pages missing, entire months that seem to have been edited out of existence. It is as if some force continues to work to obscure the truth of what happened that November night. And sometimes, on foggy evenings when the boundary between day and night becomes uncertain, people walking along Newport's cliff walk report seeing a woman in white standing at the edge of the rocks, gazing out at the Atlantic with eyes that reflect stars not visible in Earth's sky. She never acknowledges observers directly, but those who see her find themselves drawn to return to the same spot night after night, waiting for something, a sign, a revelation, an invitation to join something greater than their mundane existence. These individuals rarely speak of their experiences, but they share certain characteristics, an otherworldly beauty that seems to increase with each passing day, an uncanny ability to influence others, and a growing detachment from the concerns and limitations of ordinary human life. Perhaps Dr. Hartwell was wrong. Perhaps Vivian Ashworth's promise of a new age of human evolution was not a delusion born of otherworldly manipulation, but a genuine prophecy. Perhaps the transformation she and Thomas underwent was not an ending, but a beginning, the first step in a process that continues still, quietly, patiently, selecting candidates for metamorphosis from among those who walk Newport's storied streets. After all, evolution has never been a democratic process. It selects the few who are ready to leave the old forms behind and embrace whatever comes next. And in a world growing stranger by the day, where the boundaries between possible and impossible grow thinner with each passing year, perhaps Vivian Ashworth's vision was not madness, but prophecy. The question that remains is not what happened to the disgraced socialite who disappeared in Newport in 1889. The question is, when she returns, and the evidence suggests that she will return, will humanity be ready for the transformation she offers? Will we have the wisdom to recognize evolution when it presents itself? Or will we cling to our limitations until they become our extinction? Only time will tell. But for those who know where to look, for those who understand the signs, the process has already begun. The seeds planted in Newport's Gilded Age soil have been growing in darkness for over a century. And now they are ready to bloom. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of Newport's hidden history compelling, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Vivian Ashworth was a victim of supernatural manipulation, or a willing participant in humanity's next evolutionary step? Have you experienced anything similar in your own encounters with places where history seems to linger? Subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries that history prefers to forget. And remember, in a world where the impossible becomes possible with increasing frequency, the only certainty is that we have much yet to learn about the true nature of reality itself. Until next time, keep watching the shadows. You never know what might be watching back.